Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Claire Lewis with the Florida Friendly Communities. I'm the statewide coordinator for the Florida Friendly Communities program. Today's webinar is Common Landscape Installation Mistakes, brought to you by Erin Alvarez with the University of Florida Department of Environmental Horticulture. And before we get started, I would like to remind you to fill out the exit survey when you leave today. This gives us valuable information on how we're meeting your educational needs and what topics are of interest to you in the future as we start to develop our 2021 webinar agenda. So our next webinar is Landscaping for Climate Change. It will be held December 8th at 11 o'clock. This is a time change for us. We typically hold them at 10. So just keep note that next month's webinar is at 11 o'clock, and it's with Dr. Gail Hansen and Professor Michael Volk with the University of Florida. And just to remind you, your microphones have been muted, so please type your questions into the chat box and we'll take questions throughout the webinar and definitely at the end of the webinar. This course has been approved for one Landscape Architecture CEU through the Department of Business and Professional Regulation. I'll put the link in the chat box. If you'd like credit for this CEU, please follow that link and submit the $10 administration fee and enter your name and license number. That's the information we'll need. And with that, I'd like to turn the screen over to Tom Wickman to introduce today's speaker.
Claire, thank you so much. I'm Tom Wickman. I'm the statewide coordinator for the Green Industries Best Management Practices Program with the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. Goodness gracious, that's a long title, but it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. With us today is Erin Alvarez. She teaches plant propagation and related courses at University of Florida for Environmental Horticulture and the Plant Sciences degree program. Her teaching program focuses on sustainable plant production and use along with plant-people interactions, and she manages the Fifield Foodscape Teaching and Demonstration Gardens. Erin's a longtime friend of mine, and she's an amazing horticulturist. She has a wealth of experience, and she's very respected in the field. She combines all this with an incredible energy, and she brings that energy to her presentations. Today, Erin will be talking about a very important topic, common design and installation mistakes. She'll help you learn how to get plants installed correctly and avoid those problems that might pop up if they're not installed in the right way. With that, I'll turn it over to Erin. Erin, thank you so much for being with us, and take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Tom and Claire and Emily and everyone at FFL. And thank you very much to y'all for being here. I hope everyone can hear me okay. If not, or if you have any issues with connections, please just pop into the chat box and let our panelists and me know so that we can correct everything. As Tom mentioned, I have been involved in environmental horticulture and the Florida Friendly Landscaping program since I was a student. And I've known Tom, gosh, since what, 2001? Tom, I'm going to date ourselves here. And I've known many of y'all out there watching today. So thank you for joining. For those of you I don't know yet, it's nice to meet you or see you. And I'm looking forward to spending this time with you today. I'm going to share my screen here so that y'all hopefully will be able to see my presentation. And I did want to start out with a slight, hopefully everyone can see that okay. A little bit of an introduction. And as many of y'all know who watch the news and are familiar with Florida ecology and our environment, I titled my talk today, Mind the Sinkhole. And I hope you don't mind me being a little bit on the nose with our timely references. But if any of you keep up with state news or have seen what's going on in Gainesville, we currently have a large sinkhole opening up, not large by sinkhole standards, but large by Gainesville neighborhood standards on the northwest side of town. And as I was kind of putting the final thoughts together for this talk, this was coming up in the news several weeks ago, about a month or so ago, and people have been keeping an eye on it. And it really brought home a lot of the issues and concerns that I've dealt with since the beginning of my career in environmental horticulture and Florida landscapes. And with that, I wanted to kind of frame this talk around those big picture issues. A lot of folks tend to give webinars or give talks, that are focused specifically on, here's the top 10 things you need to do to plant a plant correctly. And there's a a ton of great resources out there on that type of information. What I want to do today is talk about how we look at these issues from a bigger picture and how we can incorporate things like the Florida-friendly principles, great information that should guide all of our landscape practices, our best management practices for GI-BMP, all of those resources that we learn and all of those content-based tips that we learn to apply to our landscapes. How do we look at those big picture? So with that, let me make sure my slide will advance here. Hopefully y'all can see that. Just to introduce myself a little bit more comprehensively, having come into environmental horticulture and landscaping, like many of us do, at a little bit of a later age or a little bit sideways, it's always been kind of a disconnect with where I picture my professional role and where other people see me, where my friends see me. So a little bit of background about me. Before I was involved in environmental horticulture, I gardened all my life, and with my mom, just ornamental gardens. It's kind of a dirty family secret that we never grew vegetables, but my grandparents did. My mom and I grew a lot of ornamentals, and I learned that as just a hobby, as something that we would do for fun, for fulfillment, and didn't discover it as a career until later in my life. And because of that, I have a lot of friends in the industry and in gardening and in horticulture that I've met at different stages in my professional and personal path with plants. A lot of my friends I went to school with, many of my friends went to school with me in environmental horticulture, but I also had a lot of friends who went to school in other programs, or friends who are landscape architects. And a lot of them, when I told them I was in environmental horticulture, they, oh, are you mowing lawns? Well, yeah, I did for a while, but that's not what I do now in my job. My dad thinks that, I'm a university professor and I wear tweed patches on my elbows and, go to work every day in front of a chalkboard still. Society increasingly is looking at folks who do education and academia as something that we don't actually do, or that we have a lot of free time. I remember being told when I was taking my first position with UF that I'd have plenty of time for yoga classes and coffee. And as many of y'all know, it's anything but. My students think I spend all my time on the computer, and increasingly I do, especially lately, like many of us, but we do spend quite a bit of time in the field as well. Obviously, and this is an old meme, forgive me, I should have started with that, but it's an oldie but a goodie, so I'm bringing it back. I juggle a lot of plates, right, like a lot of us do, and so my teaching appointment is 100% these days. I focus exclusively on student professional development and education with, as Tom mentioned, public horticulture and propagation. I still get asked extension questions. Folks still contact me to ask me for feedback on their landscapes or plant identification or resources if they're starting out. And so I spend a lot of time connecting people. And that brings me to that last component. Even though I don't have an extension appointment anymore, like many of us in IFAS and in our industries, we spend a lot of time connecting dots and putting people together to make a bigger picture or a bigger package for our Florida landscapes. And so that sense of connection, that sense of how we solve problems by using multiple resources or the networks at our disposal or the full suite of our knowledge is kind of where I'm hoping to go as we continue talking today about our landscapes. And I'll talk about our plan next, but before that, I want to know who y'all are. So thank you for putting in information in the chat about where you're from and what county you're from. I see a ton of agents. Shout out to all the extension agents and folks who work in extension out there. It wasn't mentioned specifically, but I was fortunate enough to work in Sarasota County Extension for a few years, and I see some folks I know from there. Hello to you, Wilma and Alicia, and folks I probably missed in the chat. And I got to know some great agents in working in extension. And so I know that for a lot of folks, you're professional, right? You're landscape architects, you're extension agents. Many of you out there might be master gardeners, some industry folks in the chat, and that's wonderful. Part of thinking about these landscape issues and landscape challenges is realizing that, as many of y'all know, everyone's coming into landscapes from a different perspective. Our clients have one perspective and focus as far as landscape management. Our account managers have a different one. The educational professionals who try to help us be mindful of what we're doing and be up to date with the latest research have a different perspective of our landscapes. And so knowing who you are, who your clients are, who the folks you're working with are, who your professionals are, what they do, what their job is, what they can't do for you, what their backgrounds are, what they bring to the table as far as expectations, all of those are very important. And I'll talk about that why that's so important as we go through, but I know y'all recognize this from your day-to-day lives, right? I saw someone in the chat just said, you're a homeowner and people ask you how-to questions, right? That was my mom. My mom was the lady on the street that everybody went to for plant advice. She had no education in horticulture. All of her education, no formal education, excuse me, all of her education was hands-on and practical. You know, we have folks who come, who have PhDs in a discipline of horticulture that study something and publish regularly and get grant funding and are incredibly successful in their field, but they couldn't tell you what was wrong with a chlorotic leaf that was suffering from iron deficiency. They would know how to look it up, but that wouldn't be knowledge they had. So all these different levels of education and how we enter landscaping and landscape management are important. For those of you who work with industry professionals or who are in the industry and work with other industry professionals, we know this, right? We know the value of bringing in a subcontractor to deal with a sticky issue that maybe we shouldn't be taking on or can't take on, or know that it'll be more expensive to fix. Landscape architects rely on their fellow professionals regularly. You might bring someone in to focus on, you know, lighting or a particular plant issue. For master gardeners, you learn quickly as volunteers in your county offices where to go for particular information and what resources to use. More importantly, if we're not professional, or if we are professionals, looking at our homeowners becomes increasingly important, right? So understanding their expectations and being able to communicate about that, again, becomes important. So keep that in mind, who we all are, what we do. I see consulting arborist often gets called when the new landscape starts to die after year 1 to year 2. Yes. When I was a landscape designer, the vast majority of my clients were people who had already spent so much money, I almost felt guilty charging them because they had unsuccessfully tried so many times. And we'll talk about that as we go through today. So we know who we are. Y'all know who I am, hopefully. Here's what we're going for today for our talk. I'm going to talk about what makes Florida unique, our landscapes, our landscapers, and the folks who inhabit them. As many of y'all know, excuse me, I love doing this in a room where I can see people, but one of my favorite things to do with any talk about Florida landscaping is ask the folks who are natives, excuse me, Florida natives, to raise their hand. And I can't do that here, but if y'all, I don't know if y'all have the reactions or you can raise your hand, but if anybody wants to raise your hand to show whether you're native or not, 9 times out of 10, when I do this for industry audiences, the vast majority of industry folks are native. If I do this for homeowners, most of them are not native, or they haven't lived in Florida, you know, for longer than 10 years. And this is important, right? And for those of y'all who've dealt with this, you can tell me why. But when we talk about expectations, when we talk about what makes Florida unique, a lot of folks who come to Florida from other states bring the expectations or their normal perception of what is a normal or appropriate landscape from that other location with them to Florida. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Group in Miami, awesome. We're also going to talk about sites and plants, designs and maintenance and how they relate and how communication is important there, and then planting and aftercare. And I put fate's worse than death because, as we all know, there are worse things than having plants die in the landscape. So to start with, as I kind of introduced, talking about unique Florida landscapes. So when we think about what brings folks to Florida, often it is our unique landscapes and it is how we look and the things that make Florida interesting that bring people to Florida. We're still growing, even in times of economic downturn. Often Florida is still increasing in our population. People want to come here, and often people stay. We're special in a lot of ways, and not just the Florida man meme. I'm a native. I was born in Tampa, and I've been fortunate enough to live in the Southeast most of my life, or all my life. Most of it's been spent in Florida. And so I can say with absolute love as a Floridian, there's good and there's bad, just like everywhere. But it's important when we think about this related to landscapes, because what goes in other places often doesn't apply here in Florida, or we can make it work, but it's not the best decision for our landscapes, our environment, and our resources, and ultimately for ourselves as professionals, our businesses, and for our clients. Met a couple of folks chimed in the chat after that about having to replace plants that are dead. As we know, that's expensive on a monetary basis, but also from other resource inputs. If we tell the story of how that plant died, we can look at ways that there were other inefficiencies, and we'll get to that later. So understanding what makes Florida not only unique and appealing, but also how we treat our Florida landscapes is critical. And that's really the heart of our Florida Friendly Landscaping program, at least as far as why it's so critical that so many folks be educated about the principles behind FFL and GIBMP. And a lot of our research is spent addressing what makes Florida landscapes unique and how we can best optimize our management, design, and installation practices to protect our Florida environment, but also get the most out of it. As many of y'all know, many of our inbuilt landscapes look like the photo all the way on the right. Right? We have a retention area or a stormwater management pond. If we're lucky, there's some naturalized planting around the margin, but often it's turf, buildings, sometimes impervious surfaces to whatever code distance we can accomplish. And then what folks from up north lovingly refer to as a pond or a lake. As we know, this is not what Florida ponds and lakes how they look. This is not how they naturally evolve. They look much more like the photo all the way on the left, where you have vegetation that's very lush up to the surface or up to the shore. It's interplanted. And we know that increasingly, as we move toward responsible management of these Florida resources like stormwater ponds and how we manage our water, there's particular ways to install, design, and manage those landscapes that are best for the environment. But what do we often run into? I'll get to this more in a second, but I'll preview y'all, it's the customers often, right? Or other landscape professionals who have different expectations. Or as a designer, we might design something on the left, but by the time it gets maintained, it ends up looking like something more on the right or worse. The end result brings us back to that sinkhole that I started this whole talk with. And that's a few things. Part of what makes Florida so unique is our geology, right? The fact that our groundwater is very close to the surface, we don't have bedrock, we have lime rock, and that's often permeable and at varying depths, right? And our groundwater comes from those aquifers. And so it's sensitive. Our environment is very sensitive to resource inputs, to damage. And because of our geology, we end up with things like sinkholes that eat pools in people's homes. And I'm not saying that a poorly managed landscape is going to cause a sinkhole, but it's all related, right? It's all related. So when we think about what makes us unique, as I mentioned, lots of people come here expecting what they saw when they came on vacation. So they move here and they went to Disney, or they saw the model home with the beautiful landscaped front entrance that someone spent a lot of time and money and resources to keep up and keep looking good. And they want that at their house. And they might have it. They might have the landscape that looks like more like the one on the left for a few years or for a long time if it's designed well. Often, though, they are unwilling to, or they are unaware of the reality of many Florida landscapes, which look much more like the landscape on the right. And it's a lot of trees. We often can't grow turf, right, under shade trees. And this is an expectation I know many of you have heard again and again. Why doesn't this work? Well, here in Florida, often our turf grass doesn't grow in wooded areas, and you won't see that in a lot of other places too. So this gets back to understanding what's unique about Florida and what landscapes will and won't work with our environment and our climate. Could you have turf grass under those trees? Absolutely, you could. And this was a client I had several years ago who tried for a long time and spent a lot of money and had turf under those trees for a while, but ultimately she gave up and she went with natural leaf litter. We ended up putting some shade plants under there, made a nice sitting area, but working with that Florida environment. And this is in North Central Florida. Obviously, this isn't, Naples or an area like that. And I'll get to customer expectations here in a moment. The photo on the left was a photo I took at Kew Gardens, and that's in London. And it's very similar to our formal annual beds that we'll see, excuse me, in places that, commercial maintenance landscapes like Disney or SeaWorld or resort areas. And so high annual beds, right? High concentration of annual beds, lots of mown turf, elaborate bed lines, interplanted for color, and an awe factor, a wow factor. Is this realistic for most homeowners? Of course not. My neighbor 3 doors down, she's doing this, but she's been home all day, every day since COVID started. So she has the time and the resources to spend on something like this. But is this practical? Absolutely not. And many professionals see this immediately. But again, our homeowners don't always have that expectation, especially if they're coming from another location and don't get Florida landscapes and what makes Florida special or unique. To go along with that, I've encountered several folks who have an expectation, for the beautiful cherry blossom littered lawns with lawn trees. The photo on the left is from Pacific Northwest, and that's cherry trees doing what they do when they flower, which is beautiful and very evocative of parks and a particular type of landscape. Coming from a design and maintenance background, I'm thinking about edging all those trees and avoiding, gouging them with the line trimmer. than the labor hours I'm going to be billing for walking back and forth or driving on the gator. So again, looking at it from our different lenses is important, but a homeowner or a client or a designer may want that look. And so that's where knowing how we make that work in Florida, or what makes Florida unique and how we can use our Florida resources to replicate or meet those expectations become important. The photo on the right, some of you may recognize, that's at Lou Gardens. And that's a tab over Mondo grass. That's a tababuia over Ophiopogon. Similar effect, much less maintenance, much easier to do here in Florida. And when we're talking about planting or design, it's a lot more practical when we're looking at tree health, plant health, and reducing our inputs overall. Getting back to those expectations and what might be unique in Florida versus other areas, this is another property here in the Gainesville area that I was fortunate enough to work with and consult with a friend of mine. And this really illustrated to me a lot of the issues we've been discussing. What makes Florida unique? This is a landscape that could be in many states. I've seen landscapes like this in Atlanta, where I did landscaping up there. We have some crepe myrtles in tree rings and a lawn, and there's a drainage area and hard surfaces all around. Well, how might this impact, how might maintenance be different here in Florida versus a place like Atlanta or Michigan or Ohio for this type of landscape? Well, one, if we have St. Augustine grass or zoysia in that lawn, the maintenance there is going to be very different than if we have something like a fescue or an annual rye grass, right? There's going to be a lot more edging. Similarly, our fertility pest management programs are going to be completely different. And I hope some of y'all noticed, I hope all of you noticed that culvert, the driveway, right? So there's a drainage swale that goes in front of the house, very common in Florida in many places to have no decurbs, but a swale instead along the road. And this goes directly to, well, this goes to stormwater management that's in the county, probably to a body of water nearby. So there's no treatment for the stormwater flow through here. You can see there's turf that's commercially maintained right up to the culvert and then down to where the swale output eventually is. So there are regulations that govern how this is managed, but from a homeowner's standpoint, from someone coming from an area that's not Florida, they may not be immediately aware of these different nuances of what makes Florida different or special. And so their design, the maintenance, the installation expectations may be different. And this is why, as I used to tell homeowners, we have the little fish on our stormwater drains to remind folks that it often goes directly to a body of water, which is sometimes located right behind their house that they call a pond. I saw in the chat, what was that yellow tree? That was a tababuia. I can't remember which, oh wait, it's probably chrysotricha now. They got reclassified, I apologize. Trumpet tree. If someone knows better than I, who is more familiar with Lou, please correct me. That picture was taken about as long ago as I met Tom. So I'm sure it's been reclassified. So when we think about landscape installation and design, obviously those of us who are design minded know we're going to start with a plan. We're going to start with a design. Even folks who are strictly come into properties from a maintenance standpoint will often either sketch out or work out in their mind a little bit of a plan for what they're going to be installing or what they're going to be doing with the site. However, do we always plan? No. Do we always plan appropriately? No, we can't. Sometimes there's just reasons why you have to just put something in, or a homeowner doesn't have a design done and we're working with what we have. That's where at least we can plan on appropriate installation or plan for maintenance or try to do what we can to control making decisions for the next step. I used to hate the phrase failure to plan is to plan to fail. And that was because I had an unpleasant coach who used to scream it at us all the time. But obviously there's wisdom in it, right? And I had to put a pun, so I apologize. But it's true. How many of us have planted a beautiful, or have seen a beautifully designed landscape that gets planted out and it just fails? There's tons of talks. I know some agents in the audience that have given this talk on why landscapes fail, and there are innumerable reasons. Often, from a homeowner's perspective, the first reason is because they didn't plan. They just started popping things in the ground. Or they might have, thank you, Tom, for the yellow flowering tree info in the chat. They might have planned, but they didn't really know what they were doing, so they didn't plan well. And so it's not just about planning, it's about understanding the decisions that go into those plans and knowing the resources that you're working with, knowing the site, knowing the plant material, knowing the client, knowing how it's going to be maintained after the fact, what the expectations are for that site, both short-term, middle range, and long-term. If I had, I love this, if I had $1 for every time, oh, I apologize, I thought the slide advanced. Hang on a second. I'm sitting here talking and y'all are looking at that poor sad tree still. So yeah, Hadrianthus, thank you. That is it. The yellow tree is Hadrianthus. chrysanthus, or yeah, chrysotrichus, maybe? I'll look that up. All right, failure to plan, plant to fail. There's my pun. So the landscape design was a homeowner design that was done just to help someone get their head around a vision for a backyard. And nowadays we have 3D imaging software. We can take a photo and draw it up on a tablet or on our phone to show someone what we're picturing or what we visualize. And as many of you all know, a photo will go a long way toward getting someone on the same page as you about the landscape, much more so than a plan. Many folks can't read a plan top down. They need a perspective. They need to visualize it 3D in the landscape. And there's ones you can spend $3,000 on, or there are ones you can use for free or just make it work on your phone. But whatever it is, some sort of landscape imaging tool will really go a long way to helping both you, account managers, clients, homeowners, whomever you're working with, see what it is you're talking about. The photo there in the center, again, this is where I kind of started before I realized I was on the wrong slide. If I had $1 for every time I've pruned an overgrown Formosa azalea in front of a low window, right? I'm sure a lot of you out there could say the same thing. So this goes right back to right plant, right place. And when we talk about planning, I have been on site with landscape managers and designers who have spec'd out an 8-foot tall shrub to go in front of a window whose bottom is 3 feet off the ground. And when the idea of hedging is brought up in the long-term health of the plant, it's like, meh. Well, why wouldn't you pick something that only gets 3 feet tall? And then you don't have that problem. Well, it's what everybody puts in. So again, this planning is much more than just come up with a design or know, the criteria of the plant that you're putting in. It's also thinking about how that landscape works, larger picture, and then understanding and being mindful of what the landscape maintenance and design needs will be. Some of y'all might recognize this. Okay, hopefully the slide is back. Are y'all looking at the rain garden? I'm hoping.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Claire. My Zoom has a very distinct lag, so I apologize about that if y'all are suffering. So when we look at planning, this is a beautiful landscape that was done on the UF campus. It's in front of our Southwest Rec Center, which is the main campus gym. And I know many of us here in FFL in the panel today worked on this project or were familiar with this project, and several folks in Extension as well. This is a rain garden that was put in as part of a beautiful effort to attempt to manage our stormwater and create a bioswale, and a rain garden that would be a demonstration showpiece and be a really nice place to showcase plants that are appropriate both from a stormwater rain garden management standpoint, but also pollinators, Florida natives, really nice plant palette. Great location on campus. It's one of the main entrances to campus on the southwest side. Not so popular for football games, but very popular for parking, cultural events, etc. There's some nice sculpture, hardscaping. This was taken about 2 or 3 months after planting. It was such an important project for the campus that they devoted an entire person to maintaining this. Someone's job was to go and manage this. And this is a lot for, a public landscape management program. Grounds budgets aren't high anywhere, but especially on a public campus, to put a human on this solely to manage it was a lot from a maintenance investment. It failed. And they did just about everything they could right. The site analysis was done appropriately. It was a great site for it. Expectations were fine. Folks were okay with the fact that it was going to be a little bit different than a typical commercial managed landscape with hedges and edged bedlines. They had someone on it who understood, or they had investment in using a person who was going to be able to have the appropriate amount of time to put into this project. Today it's still there, but it's a really interesting study in what survived and what succeeded. And so I'm not presenting this as a failure as a landscape, but a case study more than anything. If you go back there and look at it today, and I don't have a picture because I apologize, every time I go by it, I just don't want to take the picture because it doesn't show you, it doesn't do it justice. I need to find a golden hour to go and take another photo. But you can see what survived and what happened. And a significant problem with this landscape, from what I observed, and feel free to chime in, I know some folks may know more than I do, was succession planning. Landscapes are dynamic, right? So in addition to what we have already talked about, understanding that changes would need to be made, new plantings would have to go in, perennials aren't eternal, right? They're not sempervirens really, they're just longer lived than some of our annual plants. So going in and doing the continued maintenance is part of planning. So it's not just coming up with a plan, installing it appropriately, understanding, you know, the site requirements. It's also planning for 5 years later, 10 years later, refreshing, replacing, continuing to maintain that landscape beyond just weeding and mowing and edging. And that brings us to maintenance. As many frustrated designers and architects have found, and probably equally, if not more, frustrated maintenance professionals have found, if design and maintenance don't communicate or work well together, you're going to end up with two completely different landscapes and sometimes more. So you can plan all you want, but maintenance is going to have that last word. And if it's professional, if it's a homeowner, if it's the volunteer kid from down the street who's doing it for hours to go to college, that maintenance is going to make or break that landscape, right? So if we consider right plant, right place, and make sure our plants are all the correct size, if we do all of our homework like they did for this rain garden and make sure that they're suited appropriately for the soil type and the light and the water requirements, that was a lot of what we focused on for this project, was the water expectations and requirements. Maintenance, again, will make or break that landscape. So please don't forget, always remember to plan for maintenance as best you can. Now you might be saying, Erin, how the heck am I supposed to do that? I'm a landscape designer and I don't have a say in who the client contacts. Well, yes, but also maybe not. Some folks will partner, right, as many of y'all know, with maintenance professionals to ensure or hope that they can ensure that their designs are installed and maintained properly, providing guidance beyond specs on how plants should be managed. Understanding ourselves as designers how plants should be managed is very important. And you know, I didn't always have time when I was a designer, and I know many professionals don't, some do, to go and look at our designs regularly after the fact, 5-10 years after, if they make it that long in the landscape, to see what works, what doesn't, what can be maintained. So planning for that maintenance, educating our clients and our homeowners about that is also important. I'm seeing a question, what's included in good maintenance? Invasive removal, mulching, pruning, yes, all of that. Maintenance is, yeah, maintenance is all of it. So that's another talk I'd love to come give. So what is landscape maintenance? It is everything that needs to be done to manage a landscape. And so when we look at our FFL principles, it's those, our GIBMP, excuse me, let me go back. Mulching, right? Mowing, plant management. So pruning, deadheading, you know, pruning back, fertility programs, pest management programs, depending on the service provided, you might do one thing. So some management professionals just mow and edge, and they manage turf. Others strictly manage detail maintenance, what we call, or high-end maintenance, where you're looking, or excuse me, high input maintenance, where you're looking at hand pruning of particular plants or container change outs. So good maintenance is less about what's included and more about completing the task to the landscape needs and client expectations. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, Bryce, but we'll have time for questions at the end if we want to get more into that for sure. I love talking about maintenance. And to that point, using turf as a default. And I love talking about this because I've worked in my career with a lot of folks who, when they don't know what to do, they just put turf down. A designer, and I went to school with an instructor who taught me, if you're not sure what to do, just put turf, just put sod. And I can hear people right now. That's like probably one of the worst things you can do aside of just paving everything, which sometimes you'd rather pave. But when we think about maintenance requirements of our ground surfaces, our surface, our ground plane elements, turf is up there. It's neck and neck with special care plants. If you have plants that have specific care needs, like something that's very fussy, like an espalier, obviously that's going to have more labor hour inputs than turf grass. But if we look bigger picture at maintenance, not just how much time does it take me to mow that lawn, but all of the input hours, all of the inputs from a resource standpoint and all of the inputs from a time standpoint, what requires the most inputs? Well-managed, healthy turf, just turf grass. I'm not talking about mixed ground cover. My yard's mowed weeds, right? I call it Florida native ground cover. Just turf grass is much higher maintenance than most other plants when we look at all of those resource inputs. And it's also the bread and butter for a significant aspect of our industry, right? It's not necessarily a bad thing, but when we look at designs or installations, is turf always the best option? And I hope that my maintenance professionals who manage turf are saying, no, not always, because sometimes we don't want to, we're going to bill them and we're going to do it, but we know it's probably not going to be best for the long-term health of that landscape, or it's going to waste a lot or spend a lot of our time or spend a lot of the client's money in maintaining it. Special care plants, things like, as I mentioned, espaliers or vegetable gardens, or a hybrid tea rose garden, something that requires a lot of inputs or maintenance expertise. Bedding plants, right there in the middle. Even though we think of annuals or bedding plants as high maintenance, it's a change in, change out, maybe some slow release, excuse me, or some fertilizer to add to that. But as far as ongoing maintenance, relatively low. And then established plantings, ground cover, shrubs, trees, things like that. And again, I'm looking big picture, all of the maintenance, not, am I going to have to hedge it? And this is all things being equal. If they're installed appropriately, if they're in the right spot, if they have the criteria or the elements they need to thrive, all this goes right out the window if we don't have right plant, right place, right? So beyond size, beyond sun and light requirements, beyond water, all of the elements, soil, management, right plant, right place is gonna, again, determine how much time and effort we have to put into our plants. I mentioned espalier. If I'm throwing around a weird word that folks don't know what I'm talking about, it's espalier, if you say it with my Florida accent. The term for growing trees or shrubs on a 2D plane, basically against a wall or a fence for time savings, but also ornament. And there's a photo of an espalier tree here in this image. I mentioned this, and I like to bring this up when I talk about landscape maintenance, because I had many clients when I was doing landscape designs who were in love with, just completely enamored with the idea of having an espaliered camellia or a rose or an apple tree because they had seen it in a garden design magazine, or they had seen it in Europe on some trip. And, oh, Erin, can you give me an espaliered loropetalum? Sure. Are you going to be out there pruning it every week? Or are you going to pay me to come and prune it every week, or manage it, or provide the extra care that's going to be needed for this plant because it's of the additional stress of constant pruning and growing and being trained. So maintenance as it relates to client expectations, again, becomes important. We can design a landscape that has espaliered trees and gorgeous ideas, but is it going to be maintained properly? Can we maintain it properly? The other photo in this slide is one of the more common things I see, and that's just unnecessary, or they want you to pay for them to put in a red dyed commercial. Oh yeah, let's not talk about red dyed mulch. We'll talk about that in a second. When we talk about turf and default turf, we have something that we use in design called cues to care, right? And that's where we have an edge or a strip of turf or a mown area to show folks that this is intentional, or we want to set off a landscape bed, or maybe offset a wildflower planting or something that's a little bit less managed to show people this is an actual managed landscape. We also will often see turf grass right up against a sidewalk to try to delineate or keep mulch back, or like you see in this photo here, provide a nice edge for that sidewalk and also for the landscape bed. But when we think about it from a management standpoint, we've got two lines there now to edge. If I'm bidding this job, I'm just dollar signs, just ching, 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 right? Just chime up the cash register. But from a maintenance standpoint, and when we look at the inputs that are required to keep this turf, this isn't the best decision for design or installation. What's going to probably happen to this turf grass if we have a lot of foot traffic? It's going to get walked on, right? Similarly, it's going to need replacing. This was up in the Pacific Northwest again, and just around this corner, you could see where folks had, walked on it, and it was just muddy. So understanding use, what makes sense from a design perspective. On paper, this is gorgeous. It's a nice little line that goes between the pathway and the landscape bed, but being on site and understanding the needs and the use and what this will translate to long term, again, becomes very important. And not just using turf as a default without thinking, but being aware of how that's managed. A corollary to this is, your mower widths. If designers could just make sure they have mower access when they put turf in, that would be great. I've got a picture about that later. Okay, so turf shouldn't be a default. Similarly, planting depth, right? So when we're installing our plants and deciding what to put in and where we're locating our beds, this is a lovely berm that's, again, this is another property up here in the Florida, Gainesville area. And this client had a landscape or a driveway that was a circle and, excuse me, had a bed right in the middle of the circle. He wanted some ornamental plants there. And this was very attractive for him. He liked it a lot, but it was a maintenance nightmare. Can y'all see there what might be happening? That's pine bark mulch on a slope. The bed is built up pretty high. I can see a few things that are going on in this landscape that are less than ideal. Some things that are done right or well. The shrubs are an appropriate height. He can see over them. The family can see over them when they're coming and going through the driveway. They're not going to be tall. They don't really need to be hedged. But the trees were all planted either too high or too low because this berm had been built up. When we came back a few months later, things had settled, and that large tree on the right there, I'm pretty sure that was an Iliocarpus, I don't think that was a little gem, had settled in and was actually about 3 inches too deep. Similarly, a couple of yards to the right, there was another landscape bed, and everything there had been planted too high because it was a nice clay hardpan sublayer there. And so when the crew started digging, they hit really hard dirt about 6 inches shallower than they needed to go. And so all the shrubs had their shoulders out. So things were too high. So something as basic as the soil on the site that, excuse me, a designer probably would have had no way of understanding impacted planting depth. And then that in turn impacted the long-term health of the plants. So this goes back to knowing the site and being on site where you're able to, but also communication with installation maintenance, or at installation, knowing, if the soil is loose, we'll probably need to plant a little high, or, make accommodations for the different soil requirements on site. Make sure I advance the right slide, which brings me to that communication. I think I have quite a few folks in the presentation today who would qualify as customers, right? We've all dealt with landscaping or landscape management as a customer. I think I have more professionals, so I'm not going to start a debate here, but I will say that there's a lot of finger pointing and blaming on both sides, right? As far as why landscapes fail and why they don't work out. Oh, I'm seeing some great questions in the chat that we'll get to as soon as I'm done. So unless Tom, you want to bring any up immediately. So when we talk about communication and communicating with customers, everyone thinks they're doing what makes sense. Most folks think, okay, well, this makes sense, so I'm going to bring it up. And this other person isn't making any sense. And, this goes for everything, not just landscapes. But one of my favorite examples of this, and the older I get, the more tragic this is, but when I was younger, man, this used to just crack me up. Are the landscapes we see in the slide here. Excuse me. So this is a landscape here in Florida, and some of you may recognize this neighborhood. And I'm not bringing this up again to call out anyone, but just to show an example of what can happen when you have these differences in expectations and communication challenges. So which one's before and which one's after? Does anybody know in the chat? Or does anybody want to guess? It's a trick question. I'm tricking y'all. The one on the right, that's mostly turf grass with landscapes, is both the before and the after. The one on the left with the ornamental grasses is kind of in the middle. And what happened with this site was the landscape is typically installed to spec as indicated on the right? This is a pretty common ornamental subdivision landscape, commercial landscape. This was maintained by a single company that managed everybody's properties in the entire neighborhood. And so we had, typical turf grass and the hull strip between the sidewalk and the road. We had, turf lawns, and then typical ornamental beds, standard ornamental beds around the house. Beautiful, gorgeous installation. Nice landscaping, well maintained. They had a plan for maintenance. They wanted to convert to make it more Florida friendly, right? So a lot more plant material went in, ornamental grasses went in, additional trees went in, shrubs, things like that. Again, beautiful success story. Most people were happy with it, but folks couldn't see out of their driveways when they were going to pull out. And a few folks complained because in the winter, ornamental grasses did what ornamental grasses do, went dormant. And again, folks had this expectation of this, eternally green Florida landscape, beautiful color year round. Plus, we had a very practical concern of people not being able to see when they, went to work or school in the morning, back when folks left their houses, everybody left their houses every day. And so this is a situation where you couldn't point to one person and go, oh man, that person just really, blew it. They really messed up. It was just a systemic situation that caused a problem. And so they ended up, some of the neighborhood, not all of it, going back to just turf grass with the ornamental landscapes around the houses. And I haven't seen it lately, but the last I heard, that was kind of where they were with it. And so this isn't to indicate, again, a failure to convert a landscape, but knowing and understanding that big picture and communicating. For that story, I have about 10. For every one of those, I have about 10 of just people not knowing things. And so this again gets back to expectations. Folks will come down and expect, you know, a higher end landscape, or they come to Florida and think they're going to have a house that has beautiful date palms in the yard, excuse me, or you know, higher end landscape plants, pardon me, without realizing that the value of those palms, or how much it costs to maintain them, and the pest pressure or fertility pressure that might come along with them. And managing that perception or expectations of customers and what they're looking for, what their budget or their maintenance going forward might be able to entail, again, becomes very important. Education about plant selection. These are examples of 2 botanical gardens that have Dianella, and I think that's a Coosa dogwood, but I'm not 100% sure in that hedge. I can't remember exactly. Hedges used as a natural example, or excuse me, plantings examples where hedges are maintained naturally. So this is something that we use to communicate excuse me, to both students, and then I have also used it to communicate to customers about a planting where it's not necessarily geometrically hedged, right? So using plants creatively, communicating to customers about options, ways to treat problems or spaces or challenges in the landscape in a creative way. These might be acceptable for some customers or some clients or some landscapes. For others, it might not. Someone mentioned something in the chat, but I'll go back and read about attracting snakes. This is a huge concern for a lot of people in Florida. We have snakes in Florida. There's really no way to keep them away. you can't really eliminate snakes in Florida, and I know that's not what you're asking here, but I bring that up because this mondo grass edging, the Ophiupogon edging along this sidewalk, and I think this is also at Lou Gardens, with the Dianella, you regularly see little black racers come out of the mondo grass and go across the sidewalk, or they'll leave the sidewalk and slide back in. And I apologize for anyone who's freaking out right now. I didn't mean to trigger anybody's snake fears, but that might not be the best planting for, you know, a homeowner, obviously, who's afraid of snakes. But even in the garden, you know, I have seen botanical gardens where they'll put up a little sign that says a snake is sunning themselves. Similarly, things like a natural hedge, having plants that grow to the appropriate size or shape that are just allowed to grow and serve as a hedge without necessarily being pruned, might be great for some clients and landscapes. Others, that might be too informal, just having the lack of edge. But as professionals, we could still create an edge just to make it look neat without having to end up going to Formosa level pruning. And I hope y'all know what I'm talking about who are familiar with hedges and edging. Here's an example of a client I had when I was a designer who had a very particular landscape and need for privacy, but also visibility around their pool. And so they had a Cephalotaxis hedge that we did not prune. We kept it natural. It made the client feel much more relaxed and informal. And so that planting, again, allowed them to have a hedge, but with a little bit of education, the client didn't even realize that they could have a hedge that didn't look like a box. And so communicating that and explaining, excuse me, that the hedge could still serve the purpose, but didn't have to look like a Lego, went a long way. And it ended up resulting in a much healthier planting, much more reduced cost for the customer on unnecessary maintenance. When we did bid the maintenance on this, we were able to have them purchase other services that they wouldn't have been able to afford had they had to have us hedge so many things. And that brings me to the fates worse than death, and planting and aftercare. So I've mentioned a few common challenges, but we know that improper, not paying attention to the site, not paying attention to the plant ID, or lack of plant ID, all lead to problems down the road, right? And this is, again, the heart of FFL and GI BMP is planning ahead and knowing what we're doing so that we can avoid making these mistakes later. Chlorotic plants, not just fertility and how we apply fertility and fertilizer to plants, but also understanding the soil that's on the site. Maybe the soil has a really high pH, and no matter how much iron we put on that soil, those Ixora and gardenias are always going to be chlorotic. Unless you use a foliar spray every couple of weeks, right? Similarly, the landscape on the right has, I don't know if y'all can see that, but there's little flagstone stepping stones that are just so delightfully dotted through the St. Augustine grass that required the homeowner to go out and prune with scissors every couple of weeks because she really was dedicated to having that stepping stone pathway. Design and installation could have solved these problems. We could have used a plant that was more appropriate for the soil so that there wasn't constant chlorosis causing the plant to look terrible, and also for us to spend a lot of extra money, time, and resources on pesticides and fertilizers to try to make that plant look better. Similarly, we could have designed a really nice, gravel or river rock or some kind of border around those flagstone pathways, or a different type of ground cover, so that the client could have the effect without the increased maintenance and inputs. So as we know, there's lots of things that can happen to our plants worse than failing in the landscape. This, I've used this in talks before. If you've seen it, I apologize, but this is here in Gainesville again, one of my favorite old hotel landscapes. And this is at a Cabot Lodge here in Gainesville. If you maintained it during this time, I apologize. I'm sure this was not your fault, but we have a few things going on here, right? So we've got a Ilex vomitoria, if you can see right up against the sidewalk. This is a lovely little Schilling's holly that was planted way too close to the sidewalk. When it went in, I'm sure it was a 1 gallon, right? It was probably adorable. It was probably about this big, looked like a little poof, cute, lined up on the sidewalk. The designer and the installer probably thought, oh, this will make a nice hedge. And 5-10 years, well, this is about 6-7 years after installation, we are now hedging that Schilling's holly, so it looks like, someone took a snowball and cut it in half. Too close to the sidewalk. Didn't plan for the final mature size. Similarly, we've got photinias, red tips, underneath the windows for the hotel. They're planted way too close to the building. They're too tall for that, that window ledge. Similar, these plants want to be about 10 feet tall, and they're in a spot where they need to be at most 8 feet, and then under those windows 2 feet. I've seen, and y'all have probably seen this too, numerous times when hedges are planted where in between the windows here, they might have used a taller plant. Let's say they put a camellia there, and then they put something lower growing, like say Schilling's holly or Walter's viburnum under the windows. 6 years, 7 years later, they're all the same height and they're all grown together, right? The designer had an accent plant and foundation or hedge plants. The maintenance has turned it into just one long hedge that's all too tall. So again, design and maintenance both have a hand in this. Pruning the shrubs like little green meatballs or green soldiers. Back when I was in extension, I wanted to start a website that was nogreenmeatballs.com. Don't do it. No, if you do it, let me know so I can send people to it. But why were these pruned like this? I've heard air circulation for pest control, not with these. I've heard job security for the people who did the job. Maybe, but could you be doing other things? The client wasn't happy with it. It wasn't attractive for visitors. So again, this all is avoidable with a little bit of education and time. Also the turf. We've got turf that was probably originally a really nice accent and caused a nice curvilinear effect to a lot of square shapes, square bed lines. But from a maintenance standpoint, we've had bed edge creep or edge line creep, where as it's continually edged, it creeps closer and closer in, gets smaller and smaller. And now we've got a few things happening. It's a wasted amount of turf. The turf that's there is not healthy. It shouldn't have been there, and the mulch is encroaching on it. Again, it's not doing anybody any favors. If anything, it's a landscape liability. So there are fates worse than death. And this is not even considering what's potentially going on that we can't see, right? When we look at increased use of water, increased use of resource inputs, chemicals that are unnecessary, money that's wasted on supplying all of those, it all adds up. Fates worse than death. A lot of folks will have this in mind, these hedges, when they think about hedges or formal gardens. And again, these are yews. This is a proper yew on the photo on the left. This is at Filoli Gardens in San Francisco. The photo on the right, this is another Florida garden with cephalotaxis. So faking it. Another thing that happens when you come to Florida, or people come to Florida, is they want that northern landscape. Well, we might not be able to have the Italian cypress, but maybe we can use a different plant that's equivalent. And so swapping or substituting plants that will fit the bill often become necessary. Using our high input plants in our high impact plants in high input locations where we can mind them, where we can install them appropriately. Here's an example of some well done and failed bulb and annual plantings. There's one is at a commercial landscape in Victoria, British Columbia. That's the long sidewalk you see there, the stone edge sidewalk. There's another bulb garden at Butchart Gardens. And then here we have a bulb garden that failed in Marietta, Georgia. And again, this is understanding the site, but also planning ahead, knowing what the inputs are, knowing what the site requirements are. This client, bless her heart, really wanted tulips, but didn't think about the fact that she needed to plan for mole and vole and local dog control. And so she had a gorgeous tulip garden around her mailbox. She located it in the right spot, but didn't plan ahead to replace the tulips as they failed. And again, we go back to our rain garden plan. Again, expectations. Some people want a very formal, attractive, high maintenance landscape, and something like a really established, elaborately designed ornamental garden like we would see at a palace. This is Hampton Court. I've seen folks who want fancy bed lines, or they expect a really tight edging like this. Well, these are done with 6-inch steel edges and a really intense landscape crew, and turf grass that doesn't spread by rhizomes or stolons. By contrast, we might have a bahia grass bed edge line, and that could be neater for the client, but edging may not be appropriate. So that's, again, we're knowing our site, and what the fate is of the plant after installation is going to be becomes important. So I know we're getting up to time, and there's lots of questions I'd like to get to in the chat. If you're not checking the chat, Claire's posting all kinds of good information about the other FFL webinars in addition to the questions we have here. But I did want to just kind of bring it all full circle by talking about the fact and reconnecting that it's a big picture, right? So it's not just a matter of how do we design for to avoid mistakes? How do we maintain to avoid mistakes? How do we educate our clients to avoid mistakes or errors? It's really every step of the way. And so things like this webinar, obviously understanding the Florida-friendly principles, GIBMP principles, applying them in the landscape. And then again, communicating back to our customers, our elected officials who set policy, the educators and researchers about what the needs are, all ties into this. So whether you're on the design side, whether you're on the installation side, if you're an educator, if you're a volunteer or a homeowner, I hope you've seen that it's big picture. There's lots of reasons why landscapes fail and lots of things we can do to prevent it. One of the biggest, though, is education. So thank you for being here. I hope that you'll continue to educate yourselves or be educated on landscape management, landscape design and installation, Florida Friendly and GIBMP. And that's where you'll find a lot of the information on, basics like the 9 principles, fertilizer recommendations, irrigation, plant selection. We have some great resources out there. So with that, we can go through the questions, and I'll take any questions folks may have. And thank you.
Great, Erin, thank you so very much. You covered a lot of ground in the last, 55 minutes. I'm not sure where to go first because you covered so much, but that was awesome. You gave the audience a lot of tidbits and a lot of good advice and real world examples. And so thank you so much for doing that. Some of the questions that were coming in, what about planting in shallow soils? They live in Miami and they've got six inches of soil over bedrock.
Yeah, so I full disclosure, I have not landscaped in Miami. Y'all are brave. I have witnessed the dynamite that's been used to plant trees. I have seen the augers broken from digging through lime rock. And I will call on my South Florida Extension colleagues here to help, but please correct me if I'm wrong. What I have seen you successfully and what I've read about you successfully are, again, appropriate plant selection, picking plants that can do okay with a thin, shallow layer of soil. If you must amend, build up, right? Raised beds, planning for drainage. With the increased incidence of flooding, inundation, and saltwater intrusion, this is me speaking not as a FFL representative, going toward alternative landscapes and alternative ways to design and manage our landscapes is going to become increasingly important. But yeah, if you've got 2 inches of topsoil and you're in lime rock, augering, digging, building up are really going to be the only, or planning for something else are going to be the ways we can go. Yeah,
great feedback. They were talking about Florida-friendly ground covers, and they wanted to know if Mondo grass appeals to rabbits.
Appeals from a culinary standpoint?
Uh-huh.
Or housing. I think I have not seen rabbits eat Mondo, but I also haven't seen much they won't eat. I have not seen deer eat much other than the fresh shoot tips. I've seen them nibble the fresh shoots coming up, but just grazing?
I haven't seen it either, but yeah. I thought I'd pass that on for your wisdom. Let's see. See if I'm looking. What was the grass or ground cover in the last picture? And I don't remember seeing that picture.
The last picture was a beach, but before that was more Mondo grass.
Okay.
It was more Mondo. Yep. And that was the client's house here in North Central Florida. And if we're talking about Mondo grass, okay, Wilma says in the chat, rabbits love Mondo in Northport. Yeah, I don't think there's much they won't eat, honestly. I've seen some good rabbit deterrent suggestions. Brie Arthur had a great point of planting, what is it, garlic, oregano, and chives, and or garlic chives, and keeps deer and rabbits away. You use as a border in front of your plants. Rabbits are delicious. I apologize for those of you who don't eat. I'm just kidding. Someone's being funny in the chat. But yeah, back to, what was that question you just asked me, Tom? Back to my Mondo point. One of the concerns, or one of the biggest things I see with Mondo is people not managing it for needing to divide it. And I didn't get to talk about propagation as a landscape management practice, but as y'all know, if you've seen Mondo, to have it keep a nice tight line, you've got to constantly be edging and pulling out propagules because it wants to spread, right? That's why we love Mondo grass. But one of the biggest reasons I've seen it fail is people not going in and propping it and pulling out divisions regularly to rejuvenate. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Tom.
Someone wants to know the best hedges or screening plants for shade. And I don't know what part of Florida we're talking about, so that becomes a little dicey. Maybe you could give a couple of examples.
Sure. Yeah. Your best hedge and screening plants are always going to be evergreen that grow to the height and density you want, right? So I've seen folks recommend tea olive, Osmanthus fragrans, as a hedge or screening plant for shade. No, don't write that down. It's a great plant for shade. Terrible screening plant for shade. It's not terribly dense. It doesn't fill in. It's always going to be a little, thin and mossy in the shade. Plants that naturally are going to do well, azaleas. Awabuki viburnum. But again, it depends on where you are and what type of shade you have. If you have building shade, not much will do well. That would be a good evergreen. Then you're going to look at a fence that you paint green. If you've got dappled high shade from oaks, and you don't mind deciduous plants, things like oak leaf hydrangeas do well. So again, it goes back to knowing your plant and your zone and what you're going for. But yeah, look at that plant guide, the Florida Friendly Plant Guide, pop in shade, your zone, and height that you want for screening and evergreen, and see what comes up. That would be my best advice.
Great. What is the best grass to hold soil in place for a yard which partially floods?
Fix your drainage. No.
One option.
So honestly, practically, probably St. Augustine is going to grow best. But if it partially floods, what kind of flooding? Where are you in Florida? Again, how is the grass being used? There's probably another plant that'll work better to hold the soil in place during a flood. Most grasses don't grow well for a long time when they're flooded regularly. But of grasses I've seen survive flooding or wet feet, St. Augustine tends to do better, but I'm not recommending that be a turf you use in a flooded area. I think fixing the drainage or another plant is probably a better area.
Yeah, looking in the chat, she said it's flooding from the bay.
Yeah. That's where you probably have a bigger issue that grass isn't going to fix. And I'm reluctant to recommend anything because contact your extension agent and ask for some advice there. And then you're probably looking at your local municipality for help. I'm sorry. As far as just saltwater tolerant grass, seashore paspalum has been used or has had saltwater used as an effective herbicide. It is incredibly salt tolerant, and my coastal landscape managers may have better things to recommend there, but paspalum is very salt tolerant.
Yeah, that's one of the things that came to mind for me. So I'm glad you brought that up. That is an option for people in coastal areas. So yep. How do we keep deer out of the vegetable garden?
A deer fence and a mean dog. No, honestly, deer fencing is the only not even foolproof, but the best way I've seen. If you can't afford that or can't manage that, scares. Tom has some great advice on deer management, I know. Deer scares, but yeah, it's exclusion, physical exclusion, and startling, really.
Yeah. And do you have any suggestions for people that are landscaping around small lakes or retention ponds?
Absolutely. If you are no matter who you are, become familiar with the latest research from CLU and IFAS on stormwater pond planting and design. There is some fantastic new information. By new, I mean like the last 10, 15 years, but it's new to a lot of folks still in the industry. Gail Hansen, CLU, FFL, BMP, all have great resources on stormwater pond design and installation. the idea of having turf grass right up to water's edge is inappropriate for a lot of reasons. It may be aesthetically appealing for folks, but you can probably get that same effect with a ground cover that requires less management. There's very little reason to have turf up to a water's edge in a stormwater pond. And I don't mean just as a, a bleeding heart hippie. I mean, just from a landscape standpoint, there's better ways to do it. And there's more attractive things that homeowners and our Florida landscapes will appreciate. So mixed plantings, look at what naturally happens in Florida and try to find a way to fit the bill. Don't just put a hedge around the pond. Start, stagger your heights, find plants that can take wet and dry conditions because you're going to have varying water levels with your stormwater. But there's great resources out there. That's, again, a whole nother webinar.
Yeah, in fact, we did a webinar on that a few months back.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's good. No, it's good. It's recorded. It's up on the GIBMP website. So we encourage, all of these are recorded, so you can always go back and, if you weren't able to catch that one, you can always go and listen. And Claire did, looks like she posted a link for some more information to some design considerations in the chat box. So check that out as well. Erin, thank you so much for taking the time today. Again, you covered a lot of topics, and the information is really good. So thank you very much. I appreciate all the audience that joined us for today. We'll do another one coming up in a month. So look forward to seeing you guys in December. So everybody have a great rest of your day, and go Gators.
Thanks, everybody. Go Gators. I have my email. If you want to forward me anything, feel free. But thank you very much.
Fantastic, Erin. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. And some people have had trouble with the CEUs. I'm not sure what the issue is. If anyone's still on the line, I have put my email in the chat box. I can also reach out to people, so maybe I'll send an email. I have the tickets ending on November 20th. I was trying to give, some time, but I'm not quite sure what the issue is, but we'll get it worked out. And sorry for the problems with the CEU.
All right. Everybody have a great day.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much, Erin.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.